Alex Taylor pressed his nose against the cold window of the small plane as it descended through the stormy clouds. Below him, the snow-covered mountains of Montana stretched out like a vast, frozen wasteland. The landscape was remote, untouched, save for the occasional glimpse of a lonely cabin or a thin trail cutting through the wilderness. He had never felt so far from civilization in his life. The Twin Otter's engines hummed steadily, but the air was thick with tension. The plane was small, cramped, and shook violently with every gust of wind. Alex had always been a city person, used to the noise, the constant hum of traffic, and the familiar bustle of life. But now he was heading into the heart of nowhere. His destination, an isolated mining facility tucked away in the harshest corners of the mountains. He was here for a 2-week stint, to work as a systems engineer at a place so remote that even cell service was a luxury. This wasn't just a job, it was a test of endurance, and something about it felt off from the start. But Alex, ever the professional, reminded himself that it was just another job, nothing he couldn't handle. The plane jolted as it hit a pocket of turbulence. Alex gripped the armrest, trying to steady himself. The flight attendant, a pale woman with hollow eyes, moved down the aisle, barely noticing his discomfort. The storm outside was getting worse. The visibility was low, and the snow was falling harder, like a veil being pulled over the world. As the plane dropped closer to the ground, the mountains loomed ominously in the distance, their jagged peaks barely visible in the thickening snowstorm. The tiny runway appeared out of nowhere, barely a speck of tarmac surrounded by a sea of white. The plane bounced slightly upon landing, tires screeching against the ice as the pilot managed to guide it to a stop. The engine sputtered and died, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. Alex unbuckled his seatbelt, feeling the weight of the isolation settle in his chest. The plane door creaked open with a slow groan, and Alex stepped into the icy air, shivering instantly. The wind bit at his face as he shielded his eyes from the swirling snow. The sky above was a dull gray, heavy with clouds that threatened more snow, and in the distance, there was only the sound of the wind howling through the mountains. He grabbed his duffel bag, stepping out onto the icy tarmac. His boots crunched in the snow as he moved toward a lone man standing by a rusted, beat-up truck. Alex Taylor. The man's voice was raspy, his breath fogging in the cold air. He was dressed in layers of heavy clothing, his face hidden behind a thick beard, the roughness of his skin telling the tale of someone who had spent years in this unforgiving environment. "That's me," Alex said, his voice sounding small against the vast emptiness around them. "Name's Jack," the man replied curtly, barely offering a handshake. He gestured toward the truck. "You're here for the night shift, right? 2 weeks. Let's get you inside. You'll be working with the team up at the mine. You don't want to be out here longer than necessary. It gets cold fast." As Alex climbed into the truck, he noticed the windows were cracked, the frost on the inside thickening rapidly. Jack didn't speak again as he started the engine and drove away from the landing strip. The road was little more than a narrow dirt trail, winding through dense trees and rocky outcrops, the storm making it difficult to see much of anything. The truck rattled along the bumpy road, the headlights struggling to pierce through the swirling snow. They drove for what felt like an eternity before Jack finally slowed, turning sharply into a gravel driveway that led up to a large, weathered building. The lights of the station blinked dimly in the distance, barely visible against the oncoming storm. The mining facility, Echo 7, stood like a silent sentinel against the blizzard, a cluster of prefab modules connected by metal walkways. The structure was utilitarian, its pale beige paint peeling under the weight of years of neglect. There was something sterile about the place, something off about the way it looked, as if it had been dropped into the wilderness without a second thought. It felt out of place, too perfect and too worn at the same time. Jack parked the truck near the entrance and turned off the engine. Alex was already freezing, his teeth chattering as he pulled his jacket tighter around him. He opened the door, stepping into the biting cold once again. The wind cut through his clothes like a knife. A door to the main building opened as if on cue, and a woman stepped out, her auburn hair tousled by the wind. She smiled brightly, her teeth flashing white against her pale skin. "You must be Alex. Welcome to Echo 7, she said in a voice that was just a little too cheerful for the weather. "I'm Kelly Boyd, station coordinator. It's a pleasure to have you here." She extended a hand and Alex shook it, noting how warm her grip was despite the freezing temperatures. Kelly's smile was wide, her eyes gleaming in the harsh light, but there was something about her demeanor that struck Alex as forced. He couldn't quite put his finger on it, but something felt off. "Let me get you settled," she continued, leading him through the entrance. As they walked inside, Alex felt an immediate shift, away from the biting cold into a sterile warmth. The walls were lined with old photos of past crews, and safety posters covered most of the available space. The ceiling was low and the lighting flickered intermittently. "This is the common room," Kelly said, waving her hand toward a large area with mismatched furniture, couches, a kitchenette, and a small table piled high with old board games. It felt strangely empty, like the place hadn't seen life in months. 3 men looked up as they entered, but they didn't stand. They simply nodded at Alex, their faces tired, eyes hollow. "Everyone's here," Kelly said, her voice now taking on a slightly more mechanical tone. "Alex, this is Wesley Schmidt, our meteorologist. He's the one who tracks the weather out here. Wesley, meet Alex, our new systems engineer." Wesley, a lanky man with thick glasses, stood up but didn't offer a handshake. His eyes darted quickly to the clock on the wall before returning to Alex, his lips pressed into a thin line. "Welcome," he said, his voice clipped, his accent faintly European. Next, Kelly introduced Chase, the geologist. Chase was younger, maybe in his early 30s, built like someone who could bench press a small truck. He barely looked up from his book when Alex was introduced, his eyes focused on something beyond Alex's shoulder. He nodded lazily and returned to his reading. Finally, Kelly introduced Theo, the biologist. Theo stood to shake Alex's hand, his grip a little too firm, his gaze lingering a beat too long. His eyes were intense, almost searching. "Interesting," he murmured, as if he were studying Alex like one of his specimens. After a brief introduction, Kelly led Alex to his quarters. His room was small, with a narrow bed, a desk, and a single closet. The walls were bare except for a faded map of the mine's layout. As Alex set his bag down, Kelly handed him a crumpled sheet of paper. "These are the rules," she said, her voice returning to that forced cheerfulness. "They're important. They keep everything running smoothly out here." Alex unfolded the paper, glancing at the list. Some of the rules seemed reasonable, almost common sense. "Don't go outside after 8:00 p.m. Always sign the log when leaving the station. Keep your radio on channel 7 at all times." But as his eyes moved down the page, the rules took a turn for the strange. "Do not acknowledge sounds from above. If you see someone you know outside, don't let them in. Never answer knocks that come in patterns of 3. Alex raised an eyebrow. What does this mean? He asked, looking up from the paper. Kelly's smile tightened, her eyes flickering toward the door. Just follow them, Alex. Trust me, it's for your own safety. As Kelly left the room, Alex sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the sheet of paper. His mind raced. The rules were absurd. What kind of place had rules like these? And why did everyone act so strange? He glanced out the window, watching as the storm intensified. The wind howled outside, and the station seemed to creak with the weight of the storm. A chill ran down his spine as the silence of the place settled in. No sound of birds, no distant hum of machinery, just the storm and the oppressive quiet. Alex shook his head and lay back on the bed. He had a job to do, 2 weeks. Just 2 weeks. He would follow the rules. He'd get the job done, keep his head down, and leave. That was the plan. But even as the lights flickered and the wind screamed outside, Alex couldn't shake the feeling that something here wasn't right. The evening descended quickly, casting a blanket of darkness over Echo 7. Alex sat in his small, dimly lit room, unpacking his duffel bag with slow, deliberate movements. The room, though clean and functional, felt cold, like a place frozen in time. A single lamp buzzed overhead, casting a pale, sickly light on the walls. His bed was narrow, the mattress stiff, but it would have to do for the next 2 weeks. The sounds of the station, the low hum of machinery and the rhythmic grinding of gears seeped through the thin walls. It was a constant mechanical drone that became part of the background noise, just like the flickering lights and the occasional gust of wind slapping against the windows. He had barely settled in when there was a soft knock at his door. His heart skipped a beat, but when he opened it, there was no one there. Instead, the stoic face of Richard, the foreman, appeared at the end of the hall, his figure briefly silhouetted by the dim hallway lights. "Just checking in," Richard said, his voice deep and deliberate. "You're getting settled all right? Any problems so far?" His eyes never quite met Alex's as he spoke, and his lips curled into a thin, practiced smile. "No, everything's fine," Alex replied, trying to sound reassuring despite the odd feeling settling in his chest. Richard nodded, offering a brief, stiff handshake before turning to leave. His demeanor was rigid, as if every movement was measured and controlled. It didn't feel like a casual check-in. It felt like a routine, one he had done 100 times before. The wind howled outside and the temperature in the room dropped slightly. Alex pulled his jacket tighter around himself and lay back on the bed, staring at the ceiling. He tried to get some rest, but the low rumbling of the station's machinery kept him awake. It was almost like the mine itself was alive, a mechanical beast that never slept. The sounds weren't loud enough to be truly disturbing, but they were constant, like the heartbeat of the station. Then came the first real sign that something was wrong. It started as a faint creak above him, a soft shifting noise that might have been nothing more than the building settling. But then there were footsteps, slow, measured, deliberate across the ceiling. Alex sat up, his pulse quickening. The footsteps were too distinct. They were slow, methodical, not at all like the hurried steps of someone walking through a hallway. They didn't echo or thud the way footsteps usually did on a floor. These were quiet, almost like someone was pacing above him. He pushed the covers back, trying to convince himself it was nothing more than the station's old pipes or the wind playing tricks. But the footsteps continued, a rhythmic, unnerving pattern that seemed to circle the room above. The sound wasn't natural, it didn't belong. Alex stood up, his heart hammering in his chest. He glanced at the paper Kelly had handed him earlier, Rule #5. Do not acknowledge sounds from above. His fingers trembled as he folded the paper in half, stuffing it into his pocket. He had to ignore it, had to follow the rules. But the sound grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't just one set of footsteps now, it sounded like two, moving in tandem, circling, pacing just above him. He gripped the edge of the desk, staring at the ceiling, trying to reason with himself. The wind, the creaks of the old building, the machines below, it had to be something logical. Right. But there was nothing logical about the way the footsteps stopped abruptly, mid-step, as if someone had hit pause on a recording. Silence followed. Alex stood motionless in the room for what felt like an eternity, the coldness of the station creeping into his bones. When the footsteps didn't return, he let out a shaky breath and sat back down on the bed. He had to admit it, something was off. But what? And why was everyone so determined to keep their distance? The following day, Alex tried to distract himself by focusing on his work. He met the rest of the crew during breakfast in the common room, a long, narrow space filled with mismatched furniture. The kitchen smelled faintly of stale coffee and reheated food. The workers were already there, eating in silence. Wesley Schmidt, the meteorologist, sat at the end of the table, his fingers drumming nervously on his coffee mug. He glanced up briefly when Alex entered but quickly returned to staring at his watch. His nervous energy was palpable, but he didn't engage in any conversation beyond a stiff greeting. Sarah, the geologist, sat next to Wesley. She had wild, frizzy hair that looked as though it had seen better days. She was hunched over a thick notebook, scribbling something with a pencil. Her eyes flicked up at Alex for a moment before returning to her work. She smiled, but it was thin, forced, almost like a reflex rather than genuine. "Morning," she said, her voice laced with an odd cheerfulness, but her eyes were sharp and calculating, as if she were constantly studying everything around her. Chase, the technician, seemed more focused on his food than anything else. His thick arms were crossed over his chest, and his dark eyes were narrowed in concentration as he chewed methodically, not sparing a single glance at Alex. There was something unsettling about the way he seemed to ignore Alex altogether, as though he wasn't even present in the room. Theo, the biologist, looked at Alex for a second longer than necessary. His piercing gaze seemed to be measuring him up. There was something strange about him, his intense curiosity, the way he watched everything, especially Alex. Theo was the first one to speak directly to him. "You'll get used to it," Theo said with a slight nod. "The place has a rhythm, you know. You'll fall into the routine eventually." His voice was low, almost conspiratorial, as if he were letting Alex in on some unspoken secret. Alex managed a weak smile, trying to fit in. But the more he looked at Theo, the more Alex felt like there was something he wasn't being told. There was an intensity behind Theo's gaze that made Alex feel like an outsider, a stranger in a place where everyone else had their own agenda. As the day stretched on, Alex's unease only grew. The mine's heavy machinery continued to hum beneath the surface, a constant presence that made the air thick with tension. The workers were cordial, but there was a stiffness to their interactions. Nothing felt casual or natural. It was like they were all playing their parts in a carefully orchestrated routine, and Alex was just another piece. The rule about sounds from above kept creeping into his mind. Why was it such a big deal? No one wanted to talk about it. Whenever Alex asked about the noises, there was an uncomfortable pause, a sudden shift in the mood. "You'll hear things," Wesley muttered, his eyes darting nervously. "But don't worry about it. Just follow the rules and you'll be fine." Theo had only nodded in agreement, but there was a look in his eyes, something like pity, as if he knew Alex was about to experience something no one could explain. As night fell once more, the tension in the station seemed to tighten. The workers fell into their routines, moving through the hallways with mechanical precision. It was like they were all trapped in their own little world, one that didn't allow for any questioning or deviation. Alex lay in bed again, staring at the ceiling. The footsteps from above had started once more, slow and deliberate, moving in a circular pattern again, just as they had the night before. He clenched his fists, feeling a strange compulsion to get up and investigate, to find out what was really going on. But the rule flickered in his mind, the warning about not acknowledging the sounds from above. And then, as quickly as they began, the footsteps stopped. Alex's breath hitched in his throat. He knew something was wrong. The silence that followed was oppressive, suffocating. It felt like the entire station was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The sounds from above weren't just random noises. They were a part of something bigger, something Alex couldn't understand, and he was beginning to realize that he might never fully understand it. Not unless he broke the rules. The storm raged on outside, but inside, a different kind of storm was brewing, one that Alex couldn't ignore any longer. As the days passed at Echo 7, Alex began to feel the weight of isolation press down on him more and more. The snowstorm outside had stopped, but the oppressive silence inside the station never lifted. It was as if the very walls of the mine were closing in on him. The constant hum of machinery and the eerie creaks of the building did little to comfort him. Instead, they only made the place feel more like a tomb than a research station. The workers, too, grew more distant. At first, their behavior had been odd, but now it was downright suspicious. They followed routines with military precision, their movements synchronized as though they were trapped in a never-ending loop. No one ever seemed to speak out of turn, and the atmosphere was so tightly controlled that Alex felt like he was a mere observer in someone else's story. He tried to talk to them, to break through their facade of indifference, but his attempts only served to deepen his sense of alienation. Wesley was still the most talkative, though his words often seemed rehearsed and stiff. He would answer questions with quick, clipped responses, his eyes darting nervously whenever Alex pressed him for more details. Sarah, the geologist, was the most elusive. She rarely spoke to Alex unless it was strictly necessary, and when she did, it was as if she were trying to distance herself from the conversation. She would smile faintly, but there was a coldness behind her eyes that made Alex uncomfortable. Then there was Paul, the technician. Unlike the others, he had started to act erratically. His hands would shake slightly as he worked, and his gaze would often flicker nervously around the room, as though he were expecting something, or someone, to appear at any moment. At times, Alex caught him staring at him for far too long, his face expressionless but his eyes filled with an unspoken warning. "Everything all right, Paul?" Alex asked one day as they crossed paths in the hall. Paul froze, his eyes narrowing slightly before he forced a tight smile. Yeah, just tired," he replied, his voice hoarse. "The air's getting to me, you know, the pressure up here. It does things to you." Alex watched him walk away, but the strange unease lingered. Something was off about Paul, something Alex couldn't put his finger on. It was as if he knew more than he was letting on, more than anyone was letting on. That night, after a long day spent performing system checks and routine maintenance, Alex lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling. The footsteps above had not returned, but the silence was deafening. The wind outside had died down, leaving only the distant hum of the station's machinery to break the quiet. Alex tried to fall asleep, but every little sound seemed to make him jump. He had grown used to the strange creaks of the building and the occasional rattle of metal, but tonight it felt different. The tension in the air was thick, almost suffocating. He felt the weight of the rules pressing down on him more than ever. Then, just as he began to drift off, he heard it. A knock. 3 distinct raps on his door. Alex's heart froze in his chest. The knock was in the exact pattern described in the rules. 3 knocks, nothing more, nothing less. His mind raced as the rule flashed through his thoughts. Never answer knocks that come in patterns of 3. His body went rigid, paralyzed with fear. He didn't know what to do. The rule was clear and he had no choice but to follow it. But every part of him wanted to open that door. What if it was someone in need of help? What if it was one of the workers struggling with something dangerous? What if someone had broken the rules and was now paying the price? Alex lay there in the dark, staring at the door as if he could will it to open on its own. He couldn't explain why, but the knock had felt different from the usual sounds of the station. It was deliberate, almost knowing. But as the seconds dragged on, his fear grew stronger. The rules were not to be ignored. The warning Kelly had given him earlier echoed in his mind, along with the eerie way she had said, "Just follow them, Alex. Trust me, it's for your own safety." His pulse raced. He couldn't break the rule. He wouldn't. For the next few minutes, Alex lay completely still, listening intently for any sign that the knock had been repeated. The silence returned, heavier than before. His mind whirred, thoughts spinning out of control. He couldn't stay in this room forever. He couldn't stay in the mine forever. He needed to know what was going on. Alex's resolve cracked slightly. Maybe it was just a coincidence. Maybe the rule was a superstition, something the workers had created to keep themselves safe from something they didn't understand. He could feel the weight of the paper in his pocket, the list of rules that had governed his life here for the past few days. But the fear still held him back. What if he broke the rule? What would happen? He had seen the way Kelly, Wesley, and the others reacted when he even hinted at the weirdness of the station. They never gave him direct answers. They only said, "It's just the way things are." The knock had shaken him to his core, and the feeling of being watched, of being part of something he didn't understand, only intensified. Alex swung his legs over the side of the bed and stood up. He couldn't stand the uncertainty any longer. He had to know. He approached the door slowly, each step feeling heavier than the last. His hand hovered over the doorknob, the cold metal sending a shock through his body. He closed his eyes, fighting the urge to open it, to ignore the rules that had kept him in check. But before he could turn the knob, the moment passed. The knock didn't come again. Instead, the building groaned, a low, creaking sound that made Alex freeze in place. Something wasn't right. The next morning, Alex gathered his thoughts and forced himself to return to his duties. He needed to get a better sense of what was really going on at Echo 7. The workers' behavior had become even more peculiar since the night of the knock. Their interactions were colder, more distant, like they were all trapped in some kind of ritual. He found Wesley in the common room, nervously glancing at his watch again. "Morning," Alex greeted him, trying to keep his tone casual. "Morning," Wesley replied without looking up. He was scribbling something in a notebook, his pen moving in a hasty, anxious manner. "You hear anything last night?" he asked suddenly, his voice tight. Alex felt a chill run down his spine. "What do you mean?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "You know, noises, things you can't explain," Wesley said, his eyes flicking around the room as though afraid someone might overhear. "Sometimes. It gets worse when you start questioning things. Just follow the rules." The vague response sent a shiver down Alex's spine. It wasn't the first time he'd heard such cryptic hints from Wesley, but now there was a new level of urgency in his voice. Wesley seemed to be on edge, like he knew something Alex didn't, and that made Alex's unease grow even more. Later that day, Alex tried to confront Sarah about the station's odd atmosphere. They had only exchanged brief pleasantries before. But this time, something about her behavior seemed even more distant. She was busy looking over some rocks at her workstation, but when Alex approached, she didn't acknowledge him right away. Her fingers traced the edge of a geological map absently, as if the conversation were not the priority. "Sarah, can you tell me more about the history of this place, the rules, the noises? What's really going on here?" Alex asked, his voice low. She paused, looking up slowly. Her eyes flickered to the door, then back to him, before she spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "The mine, it's been here longer than we know, and the rules, they're there to keep us from noticing things. But even if you follow them, sometimes they still find a way to get to you. The mine has a way of feeding off things, people mostly." She swallowed hard, glancing nervously around. "Just don't ask too many questions, Alex. Not unless you want to end up like the others." Her words hung in the air, chilling him to the bone. Alex opened his mouth to ask more, but she turned away, picking up her tools again as if the conversation was over. That night, the station felt more oppressive than ever. The silence was heavier, and the air seemed charged with something unspoken. Alex sat in his room, staring at the door, the knock still fresh in his mind. He had heard what Sarah said, and it unsettled him more than he cared to admit. The workers knew something, but they wouldn't tell him. The rules were the only thing holding everything together here. The tension, the fear, the uncertainty, all of it circled around those rules, and Alex was beginning to wonder what would happen if he broke them. But every time he thought of disobeying, he remembered the warning. The mine has a way of feeding off things. Alex stood by the window, watching the storm rage outside. The darkness felt deeper tonight. There was no way out, no escape from whatever was happening here. And no matter how hard he tried to ignore it, he knew that the knock, the sounds, the cryptic warnings, they were all part of something far bigger than he could understand. He was trapped, just like everyone else. And the rules were his only chance to survive. Alex couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong at Echo 7. The more time he spent in the station, the more the sense of foreboding grew. The workers' behavior, the strange knocks, the cryptic warnings, they were all part of a puzzle he couldn't ignore. He tried to focus on his duties, but it was becoming harder and harder to keep his mind from wandering to the darker corners of the mine. The station itself seemed to be hiding something. There was a heaviness to the air, like the walls of Echo 7 had seen things they weren't meant to witness. The isolation had started to take its toll on him, but Alex couldn't help feeling that something else was at play here, something that the workers weren't telling him. That night, after another long, restless day, Alex decided to begin his investigation. He couldn't stay in the dark any longer. Something had to give. He had to uncover the truth. The first place to start was the station's old records, which, until now, he had been too distracted to review. The computer in his room had access to the archives, and he hoped that whatever was hidden in the digital files would shed some light on the station's mysterious history. Alex spent hours combing through old mining records, reports, and personnel files. The deeper he dug, the more unsettling things became. At first, the documents seemed like routine maintenance logs, technical reports about equipment, and updates on geological surveys. But as he sifted through the years, the patterns began to emerge, patterns that made his stomach turn. There were numerous reports detailing strange sightings from previous workers. One worker had described seeing a shadowy figure in the tunnels, moving too quickly to be a human. Another report mentioned unexplained sounds emanating from deep within the mine, sounds that could not be traced to any known equipment. Alex found one particularly disturbing entry from a worker who had vanished without a trace. The entry was dated just a few days before his disappearance, and it read, "I've heard it again, the footsteps above me. They don't sound like anyone walking, more like something pacing back and forth. It's not the wind, I'm sure of it. I can't shake the feeling that something is watching me." The more Alex read, the more the reports began to show a pattern. Workers were disappearing. One by one, they vanished, sometimes without a trace, sometimes leaving behind only cryptic messages in the logs. There were mentions of feeding the mine in several reports, but the context was vague. Some workers even referred to the hunger in the mine, but no one ever elaborated on what it meant. It was as if the language itself was being carefully controlled, as though they were afraid of saying too much. Alex stumbled upon a file labeled Historical Archives Restricted Access, which seemed oddly out of place. His fingers trembled as he clicked on the file. It was password protected, but with a little digging, Alex found the password scribbled in an old note in the corner of his desk. He typed it in, his heart pounding, and the file opened. What he found made his blood run cold. The mine had a dark, hidden history, a history of strange rituals and disappearances stretching back decades. The workers were not simply being sent here to extract minerals. They were part of a larger, more sinister plan. The reports described a tradition of sacrifice, with workers being chosen to feed the mine in order to keep it running. The mine itself was described as a living entity, one that demanded tribute, a cycle that had been maintained for years. Alex's eyes widened as he read through the entries, his mind racing. When the mind feeds, it is at its strongest, but when it is hungry, it consumes. Do not leave the mine until the cycle is complete. If you do, it will take what it needs. Alex's fingers froze on the keyboard. He couldn't believe what he was reading. This couldn't be real. It had to be some kind of sick joke, a twisted game played by the previous crew. But something inside him told him that it wasn't. Something told him that the mine, the rules, and the strange occurrences weren't random, they were deliberate. The weight of the truth was suffocating. Alex couldn't stay silent any longer. He had to confront someone. And the two people he trusted most, Richard, the foreman, and Sarah, the geologist, were the ones he felt needed to answer for the strange occurrences he'd uncovered. He found Richard in the common room that evening, hunched over a map of the mine, his brow furrowed in concentration. Alex stood in the doorway for a moment, watching him. There was no sign of the man who had welcomed him to Echo 7. Instead, Richard looked tired, worn down by something more than just the isolation. "Richard," Alex began, his voice steady but filled with urgency. "I need answers. What's really going on here? Why are people disappearing? What does it mean to feed the mine?" Richard didn't immediately respond. He set the map down slowly, his fingers pressing against the paper like he was weighing his options. Finally, he looked up at Alex, his eyes narrowed in a way that sent a chill down Alex's spine. "You don't understand, Alex," Richard said, his voice low and filled with a strange, sad resignation. "You came here to do a job, but this place, it's not like any other. The mine's been here for centuries, and the rules, those rules you're so eager to break, are the only thing keeping it from consuming all of us. The cycle must continue." "Cycle," Alex repeated, confused. "What do you mean by that? What happens if the cycle is broken?" Richard didn't answer immediately. He stood up and walked over to the small window, staring out into the storm. "If the cycle is broken, Alex, the mine will take everything. It takes lives. It takes memories. It feeds off us. That's why we have to follow the rules to keep it at bay." Alex's mind was spinning. "You're telling me that people are willingly feeding themselves to the mine?" he asked, his voice rising in disbelief. Richard turned back to him, his face hard. "We don't have a choice. None of us do. The mine demands it. We're all part of the cycle now, every one of us. And once you're in, you can't get out." Alex stumbled back to his room, his heart racing. His mind was a whirlpool of questions, fear, and disbelief. He couldn't make sense of it. The things Richard had said, the reports he had read, was it all real, or was it just a product of the isolation? Could it be possible that the mine itself had some kind of power, some malevolent force that demanded sacrifice? He tried to shake it off, to focus on the logic of it all. But as the minutes ticked by, he couldn't escape the gnawing doubt in his mind. Was he going mad? Was the isolation beginning to affect him, warping his perception of reality? Or was something truly wrong with Echo 7? He glanced at the window, and the storm outside seemed even worse than before, darker, more violent, as if nature itself were pushing back against the station. The wind howled, rattling the walls of the station. He felt trapped, cut off from the world, from any sense of sanity. It was hard to tell where the fear came from. Was it the isolation playing tricks on him? Or was there something truly insidious going on beneath the surface? The line between what was real and what was in his head had become so thin that Alex could no longer distinguish between the two. The next day, Alex continued his search through the mine's old records, hoping to find something, anything, that would explain what was happening. As he went through the files, he came across more troubling details. Several workers from previous crews had gone missing, leaving behind only vague, unsettling entries in the logs. One file stood out, a detailed report from a worker named Curtis Young. His entry, written just days before his disappearance, was disturbingly coherent. "They told me not to go down there, told me to stay in my quarters and follow the rules, but I saw it. The thing that moves in the dark. It's not human, it's something else. Something that has always been here. I don't know how much longer I can hold on." Curtis's report ended abruptly, with no further entries. There were no notes about what happened to him, no closure, just silence. Alex's stomach twisted. The miners who had come before him were either lost to the cycle or erased from history altogether. The deeper Alex dug, the more the dread grew. Whatever was happening at Echo 7, it wasn't a simple accident, and it wasn't just a story told to keep people in line. It was real. And now it was his turn. It was a stormy night when it happened. One of those nights when the wind howls through the narrow metal hallways of Echo 7, rattling the windows and making the building creak like an old ship lost at sea. Alex lay in his bed, staring at the ceiling, his mind racing with all the secrets he had uncovered. The fear from the previous days gnawed at him, but he tried to push it aside. He had come to the conclusion that the mind's strange rituals, the disappearances, the eerie rules everything was a twisted part of its history that couldn't be avoided. He had to survive the 2 weeks, follow the rules, and get out. But that night, the rules didn't matter. Alex was awoken suddenly, his body stiff, heart racing. A sound, loud, jarring, and unlike anything he had heard before, shattered the silence of his room. It was a deep, resonating thud, like something heavy was being dropped onto the roof above him. The sound reverberated through the walls, and the vibrations made the floor beneath him tremble. Alex bolted upright, his breath quick and shallow. The footsteps from above, the ones he had been ignoring for days, returned, only this time it was far worse. The pounding sound, a rhythmic thud, echoed louder. It was unmistakable. Someone or something was above him. But the station wasn't supposed to have a second floor. The building was one story, with no access to anything above except the roof, which Alex knew was sealed off. His heart began to pound harder in his chest. He froze, sitting on the edge of the bed, wide-eyed in the darkness. Then it came again, the sound of something or someone walking. Only this wasn't walking, it was dragging. The dragging sound was accompanied by scraping, as though something heavy and clumsy was being moved with difficulty across the roof. For a split second, Alex hesitated. Rule #5 ran through his mind. Do not acknowledge sounds from above. He had to ignore it. He had to stick to the rules as everyone had warned him. But the temptation to investigate was overwhelming. Something in his gut told him that if he didn't look, he would never know what was truly happening here. Something was drawing him to that sound, to the source of the noise, and the pull was magnetic. He couldn't help it. Alex's body moved before his mind could stop him. He grabbed his flashlight and rushed out of his room, his footsteps echoing through the silent hallways of the station. The other rooms were dark, no sounds came from them, but he knew the workers were just as aware of the noise as he was. He didn't want to wake them, he didn't want to involve them. He needed to see for himself. Alex moved quickly down the narrow hall and to the utility corridor. The ladder to the roof was just ahead, tucked behind a maintenance closet. He hadn't noticed it before, but tonight, with the storm howling around him, everything about the station seemed new. As he grabbed the rungs of the ladder, a sense of dread crawled up his spine. He didn't know why, but the air felt heavier, thicker, almost as though the building itself was holding its breath. The ladder creaked under his weight as he climbed, each step feeling like an eternity. The wind howled louder outside, and the station's metal walls groaned, adding to the eerie atmosphere. At the top of the ladder, Alex reached for the hatch. He hesitated for a brief moment, thinking of the rules, the ones that had kept him safe, the ones that had been drilled into him by Kelly and the others. But the noise, the dragging sound, pushed him forward. He opened the hatch. The moment he stepped onto the roof, Alex knew something was horribly wrong. The roof wasn't what he expected. Instead of the flat, empty surface he'd imagined, there was a hidden structure, another section of the mine built into the mountain, completely concealed from view. The space was cramped and dark, and the walls were coated in layers of grime and dust, as though it hadn't been disturbed in years. The air was thick with the smell of old metal and something far worse, something organic. Alex's flashlight flickered as he scanned the room, his heart racing. The dragging sound had stopped, but the silence was even more deafening now. In the middle of the space, something was moving. A figure. A man, no, not a man, was hunched over in the corner, his body twisted at unnatural angles. His limbs were contorted, his skin stretched tight over bones that seemed far too long. The figure was writhing as though it was struggling to break free from an invisible force. Its face was hidden, buried in its hands, but Alex could see the sharp, skeletal outline of the skull through the skin. This wasn't a person anymore. It was something else. Alex took a step back, the flashlight shaking in his hand. What are you?" he whispered, the words barely escaping his lips. The creature stopped. It turned its head slowly, its movements jerky and unnerving, and Alex's stomach churned in horror as its eyes locked onto him. Its face was familiar, too familiar. Alex's heart skipped a beat. It was the face of a worker who had been there before him, a man who had disappeared, whose name Alex had read in the old records. Curtis Young. But Curtis was no longer human. His skin was pale and stretched, his eyes hollow and wide, his lips curled into a grotesque smile that sent a shiver down Alex's spine. "Alex," Curtis's voice was a rasp, barely audible. It sounded like something scraping against metal, distorted, wrong. "You shouldn't have come here, you shouldn't have broken the rules." The words hit Alex like a physical blow, and he stepped back, his breath coming in short gasps. What happened to you?" he managed to say, his voice shaking. "Feeding the mind," Curtis's eyes glinted in the dim light, his head tilting in an almost animalistic way. "We all feed it, Alex. We all become part of it, the cycle, the hunger, it never ends." Alex's mind reeled, trying to make sense of the twisted creature before him. What had happened to Curtis, to the others? The realization began to dawn on him, slow and terrifying. The mind, it was alive. It had been feeding on the workers, drawing them into its insatiable hunger. The workers weren't just employees, they were sacrifices. And those who broke the rules, those who resisted the cycle, became something else. They became part of the mind, twisted and warped into monstrous figures like Curtis. The truth crashed into Alex's mind like a freight train. The workers weren't just here to mine minerals or gather data. They were part of an unholy system, a cycle of sacrifice that kept the mine alive. The workers were feeding the entity beneath the mountain, and anyone who strayed too far from the rules became the next offering. Alex turned to run, his heart hammering in his chest. But before he could take another step, the air grew cold, unnaturally cold. The walls of the hidden part of the mine seemed to close in on him, and the shadows began to shift, becoming darker, more solid. Out of the corners of his vision, Alex saw movement. More figures, more twisted, broken versions of the workers. They shuffled out of the darkness, their eyes hollow, their faces pale and twisted, as though they were no longer human. They were the lost ones, the ones who had broken the rules, the ones who had failed to feed the mind. Alex's breath caught in his throat as they closed in on him, their movements slow but deliberate. The mine was calling to them, pulling them into its depths, demanding more. And Alex realized with a sickening certainty that he wasn't going to leave. Not unless he became part of the cycle. He had broken the rules, and the mine was coming for him. Panic surged through Alex's chest as the truth sank in. He was no longer sure what was real. Was this all in his head? Was he just losing his mind in the isolation of the mine? But the cold, the darkness, and the twisted faces surrounding him were too real to ignore. His body trembled as he backed toward the exit, but there was nowhere to run. The creatures, once men and women who had worked here, shuffled closer, their eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. "Don't fight it," Curtis rasped, his voice barely a whisper. "You'll join us. You'll become part of the mine. It's too late for you now." Alex's mind was unraveling. He was suffocating, trapped in a nightmare he couldn't escape. The rules that had seemed so meaningless at first, had been his only lifeline. but now they were a death sentence. As the workers closed in, Alex realized the awful truth. There was no escape. The mine wasn't just a place, it was a living, breathing entity. And it was always hungry. He had fed it. And now it was time to feed on him. The last thing Alex heard before everything went dark was the sound of footsteps. Slow, measured, deliberate, and they were coming for him. The walls of Echo 7 pressed in on Alex from all sides. The weight of the mine's grip on his psyche was suffocating, and each passing moment felt like it was dragging him deeper into madness. The storm outside had died down, but inside, the atmosphere was thick with fear and despair. The truth had settled into his bones, and it gnawed at him relentlessly. The mine was alive and hungry. The cycle of sacrifice wasn't just about survival. It was about feeding a force older and more powerful than anything he could comprehend. For days now, Alex had been haunted by the monstrous forms of the previous workers, twisted and broken, existing as part of the mine's never-ending hunger. He could still hear their voices in his head, echoing in the silence. He could still see their eyes, hollow and devoid of humanity, watching him from the shadows, waiting for him to succumb to the cycle. But the worst part wasn't the creatures. It wasn't the twisted faces or the terrifying knowledge of the mine's power. The worst part was the part of him that was starting to understand. He had broken the rules. He had crossed the line. And now the mine was coming for him. Everywhere Alex turned, he felt the weight of the decision pressing on him. Should he continue to follow the rules, to accept his place in the cycle, and allow the mine to consume him just as it had consumed so many others? Or should he fight, break free, and risk everything in an attempt to escape, knowing full well the consequences of defying the rules? The choice seemed impossible. Either way, the cycle would continue. Either way, he was doomed. It was early in the morning when Alex found himself standing in the common room, the oppressive silence of the station hanging over him like a heavy fog. The other workers, Richard, Sarah, Wesley, and the others, were nowhere to be seen. It was as if they had all vanished into the walls of the station, absorbed by the mine's unyielding hunger. They were part of the system now, part of the cycle. Alex sat at the table, his hands shaking as he gripped the worn edges of a coffee cup. His thoughts spiraled, the decision weighing on him more heavily with each passing second. Could he really escape? Could he truly break free from the cycle? What would happen to the others if he did? He thought about Curtis, how the man's face had been twisted beyond recognition, his body reshaped into something monstrous. And he thought about the others, those who had been consumed by the mine, their lives erased by the hunger that had taken hold of them. But Alex couldn't ignore the truth any longer. The mine wasn't just a place, it was a prison. And every time a worker disappeared or broke the rules, it grew stronger. The rules weren't there to protect them, they were there to keep them trapped, to keep them feeding the mine over and over again. If he stayed, he would become part of the cycle. He would follow the rules, continue the sacrifice, and live the rest of his life as a mere cog in a machine he could never escape. But what if he left? What if he ran and defied the rules? Alex's breath hitched. His mind reeled as he contemplated the consequences. The mine had power, immense, unknowable power. And if he tried to escape, what would happen to him? Would the mine release him, or would it consume him, body and soul, just as it had done with the others? In the end, the choice was clear. Alex couldn't stay. He couldn't live with the knowledge that he would die in this place, feeding the mine, becoming another lost soul in its endless cycle. He had to escape. He had to break free. As Alex made his way to the station's exit, the sounds of the mine's machinery filled his ears, louder now, more oppressive, as though it were warning him. The walls seemed to close in around him as he moved, and the air grew colder with each step. The light from the overhead bulbs flickered, casting eerie shadows on the walls. His heartbeat pounded in his chest like a drum, each thump louder than the last. But he couldn't stop now. He had made his decision. When he reached the door that led to the outside, the lock clicked, and the door swung open with an unnatural creak. For a moment, Alex stood at the threshold, looking out into the storm. The wind howled, and the darkness beyond the door seemed infinite. But before he could take another step, the sound of footsteps echoed behind him. Alex spun around, his heart pounding in his chest. The workers know the monsters were standing there, their twisted forms filling the hallway. Richard, Sarah, Wesley, they were all there, their eyes blank and hollow, their faces pale and stretched. They moved in sync, their footsteps slow and deliberate, closing in on him. "Alex," Richard's voice rumbled, deep and guttural, "you can't leave. You're part of the cycle now, we all are." Alex's throat went dry. "I don't belong here," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I can't be a part of this anymore." "The cycle is inevitable," Sarah's voice joined in, eerily calm. "You can't escape it, you never could." Alex's body tensed, his mind racing. This wasn't real, it couldn't be. They were just projections, figments of his fractured mind. The mine had taken hold of him just like it had taken hold of the others, but he couldn't let it win. Not now, not after everything he had learned. "Please," Alex said, his voice shaking. "I don't want to be a part of this. I won't feed it. I won't become like you." The creatures, his fellow workers, paused, their eyes gleaming with something that could only be described as pity. They stepped closer, surrounding him, trapping him in the narrow hallway. "The mind feeds on more than just bodies," Richard's voice echoed in the dark. "It feeds on your will to escape, your fear, your hope. And now, Alex, you've given it everything it needs." Alex's breath hitched as the realization hit him. The mind didn't just want physical sacrifices, it wanted something deeper. It wanted his soul. His resistance was just another form of nourishment. It fed off his will to survive, his defiance, and now there was no escaping. The walls seemed to close in around Alex. His mind raced, his thoughts becoming incoherent as the workers, the monsters, moved closer, their forms merging with the darkness. Their eyes locked onto him, and Alex felt the crushing weight of the mine's power bearing down on him. And then, in that moment of terrifying clarity, Alex realized the true horror of Echo 7. It wasn't just the sacrifices, the disappearances, or the twisted workers. It was the mine's grip on reality itself. The rules, the isolation, the supernatural events, all of it was part of a greater design. A design to keep the workers trapped in an endless cycle of fear, hopelessness, and sacrifice. The mind didn't just control the workers, it controlled reality itself. It was a living entity, feeding on fear and defiance, twisting time and space to keep its victims trapped forever. Alex collapsed to his knees, his body trembling, his mind unraveling. There was no escape. The mine had him, body and soul, and now it would consume him as it had consumed so many before him. With a final, desperate scream, Alex felt his consciousness slip away. The darkness closed in, and the last thing he heard was the distant sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, and never-ending. The air in Echo 7 was thick with fear and despair, but Alex refused to let it drown him. He had made up his mind. The cycle was too strong, too suffocating. The twisted workers, his colleagues, had made it clear there was no escape from the mine. But Alex was determined to break free. He couldn't let it consume him like it had consumed them. With a burst of adrenaline, Alex pushed through the oppressive atmosphere and bolted down the hallway. His heart raced, his breath shallow as his mind screamed at him to run, to leave, to get out. The door to the station's exterior was just ahead, but the walls around him seemed to close in tighter with each passing step. The oppressive silence of the mine had become louder, as though it were trying to swallow him whole. He heard the footsteps behind him before he saw them, slow, deliberate, dragging across the floor like an ancient, dead thing stirring from the darkness. The creatures, twisted versions of the workers, had begun their pursuit. They had already caught him once, mind and soul, but now they were coming for his flesh. The walls seemed to stretch and contract as though the mine itself was alive, reshaping itself to trap him. The layout of the station, which had been so familiar to him just days ago, now felt alien and oppressive, a labyrinth with no escape. He rounded a corner, breathless, but the passage ahead was blocked. No doors, no windows, just a wall of thick, heavy steel. It was as if the mine was trying to box him in, to trap him in its depths forever. Alex slammed his fists against the steel wall in frustration, but it didn't give. It was solid, immovable. He had to think. He had to get out. The footsteps grew louder. They were closer now, echoing through the halls, chasing him relentlessly. The mine was alive and it wanted him. But there was no way forward, no exit. It was as if the very environment was reshaping itself, an intelligent force making sure he couldn't escape. Panic surged through Alex's veins as he turned and ran back the way he had come, desperately searching for a way out. His mind was racing, trying to piece together some kind of plan, some way to escape. But every turn, every hallway, every door led to nothing. The station had transformed from a cold, mechanical structure to something far more sinister, a living, breathing entity that was actively preventing his escape. The walls began to warp as if they were breathing, expanding and contracting with an eerie rhythm. The once dull lights now flickered erratically, casting long, twisted shadows that seemed to move on their own. And then from the corners of his vision, Alex saw them, figures emerging from the shadows, distorted and nightmarish. They weren't just the workers anymore. They were something else, something the mine had turned them into. The figures had no real form. Their faces were twisted, unrecognizable, and their limbs bent at unnatural angles. They seemed to move in a haunting, slow motion, like the shadows themselves were alive and crawling toward him. Their eyes glowed faintly in the dark, and Alex could feel their presence in his bones, in the very air he was breathing. He stumbled backward, heart pounding, his chest tight with fear. The walls were closing in again, and the figures were coming closer. He couldn't outrun them. He had to get out. He had to escape before the mine consumed him completely. Alex's mind began to race, desperate for a way out. He had read the records, the stories of those who had tried to escape before him. They had all failed. The mine didn't just consume people physically. It broke their spirits, twisted their minds until they were part of the cycle, part of the machine. The cycle had to be fed. And if he couldn't escape, if there was no way out, there was only one thing left for him to do. He could sacrifice someone else. The thought came to him in a split second, a horrifying realization. The workers, those who had broken the rules, had all been transformed into grotesque, twisted versions of themselves. But they hadn't been the only ones. Those who had sacrificed others to the mine had been spared, granted temporary relief from its hunger. In the twisted logic of the mine, this was how the cycle continued. It required a sacrifice to feed its power. Alex's breath quickened as he realized what needed to be done. He could leave the others behind. He could sacrifice one of them, continuing the cycle, and the mine would let him go. He turned and looked back toward the common room. It was the only place he hadn't checked. The workers would be there, but they were no longer the people he had met when he first arrived. They were something else, part of the cycle, part of the mine. And Alex had already seen what happened to those who didn't follow the rules. He was cornered. The mine had him trapped. The workers, no longer human, were closing in. And the only way out was to sacrifice one of them, to give the mine what it needed. In his mind, he began to rationalize it. He could leave. He could finally escape. He could survive. But as he stepped toward the door of the common room, Alex hesitated. His hand trembled on the handle. Was he willing to do this? Was he willing to condemn someone else to the same fate he was trying to escape? When Alex pushed the door open, the room was empty. For a brief moment, it felt like the mine was holding its breath. The oppressive air seemed to lift slightly, and for the first time since he had arrived, Alex felt like he was alone. But it didn't last. The moment he stepped inside, the door slammed shut behind him with an unearthly screech. The lights flickered, casting a sickly yellow glow across the room. And then from the far corner a voice spoke. "You thought you could escape." Alex turned quickly, his heart hammering. There, standing in the corner of the room, was Theo, his face twisted into a grin that sent a chill through Alex's spine. But it wasn't Theo, not really. The creature that had once been Theo stepped forward, its body jerking unnaturally. "You broke the rules," it whispered, its voice distorted, barely recognizable. "And now you understand, there's no escape. The mine needs its offering, and you are the offering now." Alex stepped back, the realization crashing down on him like a wave. The mine had never wanted him to leave. It was never about the physical cycle. It was about the mind. About breaking them down mentally and emotionally, making them willing to sacrifice anything, anyone to survive. He had already been consumed, body and soul. The escape he had imagined was just another part of the mine's design. There was no running, no freedom. The mine was always in control. Theo's twisted grin stretched wider as the room seemed to close in around Alex. The walls shifted, the floor buckled, and everything he had seen, the footsteps, the rules, the monstrous workers, all merged into one horrifying truth. The mind didn't just consume bodies, it consumed souls, thoughts, and memories, keeping them in a perpetual state of fear and despair. And Alex had fallen for it. He had become part of it. The darkness swallowed him whole, and the last thing Alex heard was the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, and he knew that there would be no escape. The cycle would continue, and now he would be the one who fed the mine. The storm had long passed, and the harsh winds of the mountains had settled into an unnerving silence. The sun, though hidden by thick clouds, cast a faint glow over the snowy landscape surrounding Echo 7. The station, its jagged silhouette standing alone in the vast, frozen wilderness, seemed peaceful from the outside, as though nothing had ever happened. But inside, the mine continued its work, its hunger never truly sated. Alex's name was just another whisper in the wind, a fleeting memory lost to time, and the mine. It was always hungry. A small, single-engine plane flew low over the station, the engine's hum echoing through the mountains like a warning. The new crew of workers arrived in a similar fashion to Alex, unaware of the horrors waiting for them beneath the surface. They disembarked, just as Alex had, greeted by the stoic foreman, Richard, no longer the man he had once been, but a guardian of the cycle, a part of the mine now, just as all the others had been before him. Richard watched them with hollow eyes, his movements deliberate, practiced. He offered a greeting just as he had for every other crew before. But behind his words there was nothing but the weight of knowledge, knowledge of what the mine required. The workers, unaware, climbed into the truck, following Richard up the winding path toward the station, toward their fate. Inside Echo 7, the new workers were introduced to the common room, the same place where Alex had once sat, uneasily observing the strange behavior of his colleagues. The room looked exactly the same: worn furniture, stale air, the faint smell of old food and machinery. The walls, covered with safety posters and faded photographs of past teams, remained unchanged. But something had shifted in the air. Something invisible, like the station itself, was aware of the new arrivals. The workers, fresh faces with their hopes and dreams intact, looked around, unsure of what to make of the place. But the rules were already being etched into their minds. Just as Alex had been given the sheet, the newcomers were handed their own set of rules. Don't go outside after 8 p.m. Always sign the log when leaving the station. Never answer knocks in patterns of 3. And of course, the rule that would bind them all to their fate: do not acknowledge sounds from above. They read the rules, but they didn't understand. Not yet. They would. As the new crew settled in, Alex's fate was sealed. He had become part of the mine, just as all the others before him had. He was now a memory, a ghost trapped in the cycle, unable to escape. The workers, like Alex once had, followed their routines, day by day, night by night, each of them unknowingly stepping into the same trap that had claimed those who came before them. The mine's power had grown stronger, feeding off their compliance, their fear, and their willingness to follow the rules. The rules were never meant to protect them. They were meant to condition them, to keep them docile, to keep them from breaking the cycle. And as the days passed, strange things began to happen. One worker, a young man named Mark, began to hear the footsteps above his room. At first, he ignored them, chalking it up to the usual creaks of an old building. But soon the pacing became louder, more distinct, as though something was walking directly above him. He knew the rule. He knew not to acknowledge it, but the sound was too strange, too unnerving. The other workers watched him, their eyes full of quiet dread. They had all been there once. They had all heard the footsteps, had all broken the rules, but they didn't speak of it, not yet. At dinner that night, Mark mentioned the noises to the others. A hushed silence fell over the room. No one talks about it, Sarah, the geologist, said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Her eyes flickered to the others. You've heard it too, haven't you? Mark looked confused. What? The footsteps? Sarah nodded slowly, her face pale. We don't talk about it, we just follow the rules. But as Mark's curiosity grew, so did his unease. The whispers of the past workers, now transformed into something monstrous, began to echo in his mind. He started to question the mine's purpose. Why were they here? Why did they follow these strange rules? And most terrifying of all, what happened to the workers who broke them? That night, Mark went to the utility corridor, searching for the ladder to the roof. He had to know what was up there. He had to understand. But as he approached the hatch, the air grew colder. The walls seemed to shift around him, the familiar station suddenly feeling foreign, hostile. He hesitated, his hand hovering over the hatch. Suddenly, he heard the footsteps. They were closer than ever before. And then, 3 knocks. Mark froze, his body trembling. The rule flashed in his mind, and he remembered Alex's fate, the twisted figures of the past workers, and the warning in the back of his mind. The knocking continued. 3 knocks. Then a pause, 3 more. Mark's heart hammered in his chest as he backed away, but he was already too far gone. He had heard the knock, and now the mine would claim him too. As the days passed, Mark's behavior changed. His eyes grew distant, his movements stiff and mechanical. The other workers watched him closely, but no one dared to ask what had happened. They already knew. The mine had claimed him, and the cycle continued. The mine was never truly defeated. The workers came and went, each one unknowingly becoming part of its dark design. They were drawn in by the rules, bound by their fear, and forced to feed the cycle of sacrifice. The rules were the mine's way of controlling them, bending them to its will. Breaking them had consequences, terrible, irreversible consequences. Alex, now a part of the mine's dark past, was forgotten. But his story would never truly end. Every new worker, every new shift was just another chapter in the never-ending cycle. And as the years passed, the mine would continue to grow stronger, always hungry, always feeding off the souls of those who dared to enter its grasp. The workers who arrived at Echo 7 would never realize it, but they were already part of the cycle, and the mine was always watching. The cycle would continue,